Welcome to the studio. This month, I'm showing you how to paint a sphere. And it's a lot harder than I make it look. So if you're planning on following along, I recommend that you take your time. Give yourself a good 2 to 3 weeks to be able to do this project. Because the first layer that we do, we'll let it dry. The second layer we'll do, and it takes a long time. Let it dry. And then maybe we have to do that layer again or move on to the final layer. So with 3 layers and drying time in between, 2 to 3 weeks is a really good time frame. If you are looking to do this as a follow along tutorial, you will want to go to the Patreon exercise where I outline how to do a hue balanced value scale, because this is exactly what I do when I string out my palette. It's essential and it's really important if you're going to paint this sphere, because if you don't use the right combination of pigments, your sphere will either look too blue or too brown, or a mix in between both that kind of like bounces back and forth and it looks really weird. So please do that exercise first. The other thing you want to keep in mind is you can paint from the picture that I provided. However, I do recommend you paint it from life like I did. So you can find these styrofoam spheres online. Just Google styrofoam white sphere. Mine came in a packet of I think 6. I think they're also available at Michael's Arts and Crafts if you're in the United States. But it is important to work from life because we see so many subtleties without the influence of the camera. I'm sure you guys know when you're trying to take pictures, especially if you're trying to take a picture of a white object, it's really hard to balance the exposure compared to the background and making sure that you're not pushing things too dark to make sure that the lights show. You'll see that in this video when I focus on the painting, that's exactly what's happening. You'll be able to see the painting really well, but it's not able to focus on the sphere as well, so the lights look bleached out. When you're painting from life, you won't have this issue, so that's exactly why I recommend you do it from life. So anyway, it took 3 different painting times to be able to do this. So you'll see the first layer, I did the drawing, and then I did the dead color layer. So I essentially chose one color for each shape. So one color for the sphere in the light, one color for the sphere in the shadow, one color for the background, summarizing the colors as best that I could. So if you had to summarize, what color would you choose, and putting that down so that the entire canvas is covered. And this really helps because if we were to start to try and describe the form of something without putting the surroundings in, the relativity of color is really difficult to overcome. So by putting in the background, we can then compare our lightest light and our darkest dark as well to the values that come on the next step. So after doing that first layer, let it dry for a few days. It has to be dry to the touch. The next layer is where we start to create form. And I started to lay in the values to create the volume and the fall of light, the illusion of light falling across this form, this rounded thing. The final layer is to finish. So one thing that I recommend is to separate these 2 layers. Find your form. If it's not perfect, let it be. Give yourself the opportunity to then paint over it again and smooth out and fix anything that's wrong. And that form is the hardest part. And so make sure that when you're laying out your palette, your strings, you have like 30 different values on there. It's gonna make it so much easier. Also make sure you have a bunch of different brushes. That also makes it a lot easier because you're gonna start painting and you'll find that you have a dark brush and a light brush and a bunch of middle brushes, and you wish you had more on either end. So I do recommend making sure you have a great number of brushes at a variety of sizes. And the other thing is be patient. I'm gonna do this and it looks a little bit easy. I'm not struggling as much because I've done this a lot. I've been painting for a long time. If it's your first project or your first attempt at painting a sphere and you think, it's gonna be easy, don't feel bad if it's not, because it's actually really difficult, and once you conquer it, you're already on your way to achieving so much more in the form of the projects that you're going to be working on in your own studio, like portraits or still life. So it's essential to learn how to paint this and do it well. So If you follow along, good luck. If you're just watching to learn how it's done, thanks. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoy. With this wash on here, it's still wet and that's fine. I'm just going to be doing the drawing. The way you want to think about this is, and when you're doing site size, you want to think about where the top, the bottom, the very far right, and the very far left of your object are, and place them on the canvas. So the easiest way to do this is to hold up either a knitting needle or your brush, and to see where the bottom is, line it up with the bottom of the sphere, and see where it crosses your page. And wherever it's crossing the page is where you then want to make your mark. And then stand back and double check. And in that way, you're going to be able to make it the same size. So I'm going to do that by standing back from my point of view here, slightly different point of view than the camera. Making a sketchy ghosty mark, standing back, taking a look at it. I will then hold up my knitting needle, holding it straight across and seeing if it is indeed on the same line. And it looks like it is. So then I'll go and I'll do the top. That looks a little big. And it is. Now that looks about right. And the way we can double check that is to then measure the distance between the top and the bottom and slide it over and see if those two distances match. And when they do, we know we're good to go. And what you can do then with the line that's wrong is try and just push it out of the way a little bit. Or maybe it wipes off, but I'm using canvas paper so it doesn't really wipe off very well. Okay, from there we know that this is a sphere. So from top to bottom will be the same as from left to right. So if I want the left part to be here, we will do something just like that. Okay, now this is just the beginning, it's the placement. And thinking about this relationship to the background and the box around it, what I want to do is put in that horizontal back line plane so I can really ground myself and ground the sphere. It'll make it look like instead of it's floating in space, it has a space to exist. So the same kind of thing happens where if you were to hold up in a horizontal line, you would want to see whereabouts it would cross. Make a mark and then double check. That looks a little low. Yeah. And then, in order for it to go straight across, the easiest way is to just do something like this. Nice, sketchy, long strokes. Okay, now from here, we want to establish the construct of the sphere. And that means chipping away at it until it starts to look more round. So I'm going to start to do that. The first thing that I'm going to do, because this is a round object, is I'm going to split it in half one way and split it in half the other way. And check those measurements real quick. So then I know where the exact center is, and that's really helpful because it's going to be equidistant from that exact center all the way around, right? So from here to here also equals here to here will also equal here to here. So it will help me double check. So before I do anything like measuring, I'm going to try and sort of chip away at this as if it were maybe a block of marble, right? So rather than go in with anything too crazy, like assuming that I know where the curves are, I'm going to start to chip away at this form. If I know this is true, I know it has to meet up well with each side. So I'm using straight lines to create curves. I'm not going beyond my original lines. I'm not going too far inside them either. Now, at this point, it's going to still look a little bit wonky, and so I would want to continue to refine a little bit at a time. And then what we can do is check so we know from the center to the top should equal the center to the side. And it should be able to go around and follow that center to the top equals center to the side. So it will help me then, as I'm looking to refine the drawing, articulate my construct. It's really helpful. Mm-hmm. Good. Not bad. And this can be refined even more once I start to lay in the colors that separate everything. But for now, I think it's a good articulated start. What we also want to do is establish where the cast shadow is. And the cast shadow is coming off of the bottom. And it has a distance. So I'm going to assume you can measure the distance. So from here to here, or from the center out, and then slide it over and go the center out. That's a really good way to do it. Now, I'm trying to mimic that cast shadow and construct it based on what I see. Looking at distances and relationships. And so right now, this is a good start right here. It's a good start. And I might go beyond this a little bit. We can fiddle with that later. Now, the last part of the drawing that I like to do is get in where the shadow shape exists. And so when I'm looking at this sphere, I'm looking at the darkest part of the shadow before it starts to get light again. Darkest part of the shadow next to the lights, and that's going to be the edge of the shadow. That's going to be the line that I want to find in the distance. So as I'm looking at this, I'm trying to see the distance. I'm looking at the distance here, like that. My ball looks a little small, so I can make it a little bit bigger. Now, if you make a mistake, you can take a little bit of mineral spirits, and depending on the canvas that you're using, let's say I wanted to change this line, I can push and scrub that paint, kind of moving it out of the way a little bit. If I wanted to articulate this a little better, and make it go just a little bit bigger all the way around. I'm pushing and scrubbing to expand. So that's a good way to make edits. Now I have to do that all the way around. So again, it's not perfect, but we're just trying to get something close. And we will continue to perfect the more paint we get on here. You can do the same thing if you wanted to. Be really perfect about it at this stage. You can do the same thing from the outside by pushing that color. If it didn't dry yet, which is kind of drying, pushing that color to try and edit it. It's not really working so well, but what I would like to do at this point is kind of scrub out that center a little bit so there's nothing too dark in there, and then finish this shadow shape. And the shadow shape and if you wanted to at this point, you could fill in your shadow with a little bit of raw umber to get a better sense of the light shape, shadow shape, but you don't have to. You could also put in a little color for the background. Now, I realized that I rushed through those measurements, and with the camera in the way here, the ball is still too small, so I'm going to go in and continue to try and use the mineral spirits to expand it out. But if I can't, because of the drying that is happening here, then I will do those adjustments when I start to lay down the first bit of paint. And when you lay down the first bit of paint, it will be a summary color for the lights and a summary color for the shadows. So one color for the lights and one for the shadows, rather than finding the variations within. And we can even sort of soften this line a little bit so that it doesn't take over as anything too extreme. And that's a good start. Now, the best thing that you can do is to mix all of your colors on your palette strung out in terms of value. So you can see here, this is my palette, and I have ivory black, raw umber, and titanium white at the top. And what I did was I mixed all the values that I could in between, from the darkest dark to the lightest light. Now if I had just used ivory black and white, it would have been very blue, but I mixed in a little bit of raw umber to sort of eliminate that blue hue to make it look more neutral. It's a really good thing to know and to do, and you should have done that as well on your value scale. Alright, so to begin, you want to lay down your darkest dark, your lightest light, and your background. So the darkest dark is going to be pure black, and that's going to be off to the left and directly underneath the ball. So I'm just going to do that real quick with the color here. I'll lay down. My darkest dark. And my lightest light in my background. Now I'm going to, as you should, treat the lightest light like the white of the ball. We're going to treat this very simply. We're going to just take pure white, 100% pure white, and cover the light shape of the ball completely. And by this time, your underpainting should be dry. So the goal here is to lay down a foundation. And the best foundation is simple but helpful. So white is interesting because it takes a couple layers for it to look its lightest, even if it's titanium white like this one is. So I'm going through here with the first layer, and this is a local color. This is another word for it is dead color. And I'll go along that shadow edge as well. Now at this point, we're not worried about form in terms of halftone or value changes or gradation or anything. We're just laying down a nice even coat of white as our light shape, as even as you can get it, and trying to make sure that your shape is still looking good. Your shadow shape on the form shadow and the light shape as well. Now from here, the best thing that you can do is to put in the background. So the background is a dark value, but sometimes it's hard to identify. So I mixed a number of dark colors. I'm just going to choose one that I think it might be and put up a swatch of that color. And stand back. And what you should also do is, if you're not sure if it's the right color, maybe put up another value that's maybe slightly lighter. Using your palette knife. I'm going to put up a color that is actually also in between those two. Yeah, this one is what I'm thinking will be most accurate. Yes. So I'm going to choose this color and put it over the entire background. So that involves mixing a whole bunch of it so that I have enough to use. I'm ignoring a lot of the gradations that are happening in the background as well, because the point in this first layer is to just establish your basics. A background color, a ground color, a light color, a form shadow color, and a cast shadow color. So we can cover the whole thing in as simple of a color scheme as possible, so that when we do our second layer after it's dry, we can start to figure out the exact values as the light is changing across the form. So I'm just going to double check that that color is the same, and it is. And so I'm actually going to try and be quick about it and use this palette knife to help me put down a bunch of it. You could also use a brush. Now, I'm going to scrape off these colors that were wrong, especially the one that's too light. And cover it up well. And I'm going to go in with a brush. And I'm not using any medium except what's in the paint. So it might feel, as you're sneaking up to edges, a little dry. And that's fine. It's better to sneak up to the edges with not too much paint, kind of a dry brush, than it is to bring too much paint to the edge of anything. And later we can sort of soften that edge a little bit. I'm kind of also just using the paint that's up here because we don't want too much paint to gather. We just want enough so that the paint is not transparent, and so the paint is opaque and is showing us its true color. To avoid glare, you want to make sure that your brush strokes are going in the right direction. Sometimes it's up and down, sometimes it's down, sometimes it's left to right, sometimes it's right to left. So you just want to make sure you're doing the right thing from your vantage point. Just get the paint down there. And same thing over here. Now, at this point, because everything's still wet, I'm going to continue on, find this color, then I'm going to finesse everything. So making sure that the shapes are looking good and that the edges are soft and all of that. At this point, I think it's beneficial to put down something for the cast shadow. And the cast shadow is just off black. taking this color, which has a little bit of raw umber and ivory black and white, mostly black. I'm putting it in there because I need to make sure that I have the contrast that I need so I don't go too dark on that ground plane. And it's a good thing I did that because I think I would have gone too dark here. When I put this color up next to the cast shadow, if it disappears more than it's disappearing up there, then it's not working. So I have to go lighter. You can even sort of get rid of that back horizon line a little bit. You can always get it back later. Now, I actually think that that cast shadow can go darker, and I have room to go darker. I'm gonna put it in. No, it's not pure black because there's mixing in with the paint under it. So there is white in it. Yeah, that looks better. That looks much better. And then I can get that horizon line back. Really, it's just kind of with a line. The ground plane is lighter over here. It's closer to the light, so I will make it just a little bit. I don't have to at this point, but I'm just going to make it just a little bit lighter. Again, this is about a summary. So I don't want to spend too much time on these tiny increments of change. At this moment, my time is better spent covering the whole canvas so that later I can assess the variations here and within this comparatively. So you may have heard that color is relative and value tends to trick us a little bit. So it may be that I think that this is lighter at this moment in time than it actually is, or in other words, I may be pushing this lighter because this is so light next to it, I don't have that over here, that it's confusing me to think that, wow, this looks so dark, I need to go lighter, when in fact it's only because this is so light down here. Now sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes, you know, we might see value in the right way, but the best thing you can do for yourself at this moment is to just cover your major areas and then assess everything as a whole. Kind of softening that edge a little bit. There. That's about good. Now with those summary colors in there, I can start to take a look at what I think could suffice as an overall color for this shadow. And it's going to be slightly lighter than the background. Maybe I could just put a little something in there. Yeah, that doesn't look too bad at all. Let's go ahead and use this as our summary color. So I'm saying summary color. It's not like necessarily the lightest color or the darkest color. It's a color that is maybe most seen or in the middle of the darkest darks and the lightest lights that exist in the shadow. Either way, we want it to rest kind of in the middle so it doesn't really throw us off too much. I'm also sneaking up to those edges, trying not to use too much paint at the edges. Trying to keep those edges soft. If the paint mixes in a little bit, that's okay. And now that I've gotten everything in there, it's time to fix some shapes. I think I need a little bit of light in this shadow so I can see it apart from the background better. I don't want it to disappear completely. That would not be helpful. Trying to fix the shape as I go. And then I'm going to take a clean brush and go around the edges, starting with any big errors. Just try to clean it up a little bit. It's okay that it's getting sort of contaminated. That's not a big deal at all. So if I had too much paint at the edges, this would be really difficult to do. So that's another reason why you want to sneak up to those edges with almost like a dry brush, but make sure you cover the whole thing too. Softening between here, making sure that the shadow edge meets the light edge, so there's no paper coming through or no canvas coming through, but still just trying to hold on to the shape. I don't want to lose the edge. So I'm just kind of smoothing this out, flattening it. Making sure there are no ridges. And some might call this blending, but really what I'm trying to do is soften the edge and fix the shapes, and I'm not worried about value gradations at this moment. I am just worried about I want it to be flat, no ridges, and I want to make sure I'm getting my shapes in there well. We'll worry about everything else later. All of the halftones, we'll worry about those later. Okay, I'll go back in and just make this shadow edge meet up a little bit better here. And if there's anything that's standing out as like, you know, taking away from the roundness, background color mixed, I can use that. I have all of the colors mixed, so I can edit as I'm going. Now, if you watch all the sphere painting all the way through, you'll see why it doesn't matter if this is in pure white all the way around. It doesn't matter that this is starting to have a little bit of halftone in there. It's something that we will solve in the next layer after everything has dried. So this is called the dead color or local color layer, where all the values are simplified. The last thing that you want to do is take a soft brush and just go over the whole painting and make sure there's no ridges. For starters, now what you can do is sort of maybe slightly tap around, tap and drag just a little bit. Maybe wipe your brush off a little bit. And then you could take this brush and it's just light as a feather, go over all of the background. Maybe wipe it off a little bit if there's too much paint. Everything's going in the same direction. And do the same thing over the shadow. Okay. And then, if you're brave, use the same brush to go over the lights. But if your brush is too dark, which mine is, it will contaminate it too much, so that's when you take a new brush, new soft, clean brush, and light as a feather. Smooth everything so there's no sense of any topography to this painting whatsoever. And if that means that by accident you get a little dark where there's light and a little light where there's dark, so be it, it's fine. Because we're going to paint over this whole thing again. So don't worry about anything like that happening. Just want it to be very, very flat. There. And with that background brush, you can just sort of go over this, soften that a little bit more. Maybe soften this a little bit more. And we're done with that first layer. So I've let this dry for 2 days, 3 days, I think. Dry to the touch. And to test it, you really have to actually feel it to make sure everything is dry. And that's a really good thing for the painting. It's really healthy. You want that to happen. Now, in order to paint the next layer, we're going to have to oil in the background to make sure that that color didn't change, because when paint dries, especially darker paint, it will often, in its dry state, look a little bit lighter and a little bit grayer or dull compared to what it looked like when we put it down. And this is something that you need to keep in mind when you're painting in layers, because this background color we tried to match exactly so we could use it to then find the other values to make this sphere look round. So if we were to paint this sphere without this color being the same true color it was when we found it, then we would paint it in relationship to a background that was false. So by oiling out, I will resaturate that color that it was originally, and then be able to paint the sphere in relationship to that value in the background. And that's something that we would do with whatever painting we were working on. So I have a mixture of 3 parts mineral spirits to 1 part linseed oil, and I put it on a makeup sponge like this and squeezed it out so there's not much on here. And then what I'm going to do is real lightly dab, and you can see that there is a value change. So this acts also like what varnish would see. If we varnish this painting today, before doing this, the background would resaturate to the color that we wanted it to be, when the first color that we put down. So I'm kind of tapping. If you drag, sometimes it can come off on the sponge, because oil paint, even though it's dry to the touch, isn't 100% dry chemically. Okay, so there we go. I have a nice thin layer of this medium mixture all over. So now I can see exactly the values that I'm working with. So I've also mixed an entire palette of paints using the hue controlled value scale. And that's what it is. Oops. The hue controlled value scale. So I'm ready to go, and I suggest that you do the same in your painting. It's so much easier to have all your colors pre-mixed than to try to mix them haphazardly as you go. Okay, so the first thing you want to do at this point is to see if there's anything that stands out as really wrong. And so when I'm looking at this, I'm thinking that the ground plane could get lighter, and the background itself on this side could also get a little bit lighter. So I'm going to go ahead real quick and just do that. There's a little bit more light sneaking back in here. Now that I have that established, I am glad that I didn't do too much to the background, because the background does have to be darker than this ground plane here. And I kind of like the way that it's looking. It's close enough, so I'm going to leave it and really start to work on the sphere itself. Now, the best thing that you can do is start with the shadow. And looking at the shadow, the first thing that is imperative to do is to make sure your dark is dark enough. So I'm taking pure black at this moment, and we know, based on the sphere exercise from a few lessons back, that the darkest part of an object in space is the occlusion shadow, and the occlusion shadow is right where that sphere hits the ground. And so I'm restating that because I did put it in last time, but it could be that some paint got mixed in, or it's not quite dark enough, and I won't really know if it's dark enough until I actually double check by putting in some pure black. And I'm really glad I did that, because it definitely went darker in a good way. I can even take some black and extend a little bit more out into the cast shadow. So now I want to look at the relationship of the darkest dark to the shadow and get a good sense for the shadow color as a whole, and if it indeed summarizes it well, and what the one color that I chose here, which color is it on the actual sphere form shadow? Is it the reflected lighter part that I painted in, or is it something closer to the darks? And I like the color, I think right in here to me matches very much sort of this value here, or as close as my eye can tell. And I can see actually that, you know, having this light go all the way to the edge like this, there's too much contrast. So I'm going to start by making this ball turn back into space by putting in some dark right along the edge as well. I'm not going to use pure black, that would be way too dark. But I'm going to use a small brush because it's right at the edge of the form. And I'm going to go in there with maybe, I'll test a color. I want to choose a color that I know for sure is not too light. So I'm going to maybe overemphasize it just a little bit, just in case. Because if we put something down here that's too light right away, it's really bad. But if it's too dark, it's easy to fix. Now that's really close to the background color. So it's a little bit too dark, so I'm just going to lighten it a little bit. And now try to lay in color. And that's not bad, that's pretty good. Now when it turns under, it's definitely going to have to get darker because there's not as much light being bouncing around in this space than there is around this space. So I'm really going to push that shadow. Right along the edge. Now, at this point, it would also be wise to not get too much of a halo. It looks like there's a light line right at the edge there, and that's not a good thing to have. I'm going to take a smaller brush, and first I'm going to start with some pure black. And I'm going to paint over the edge halfway so that I'm getting both the cast shadow and that line, that dark line that I just drew. And by putting in this new color right over it, it looks like I'm blending. And it's turning the form back into space and getting rid of that halo all at the same time. So that's a very successful turning. I like that. I think that's working well. Now, in terms of reflected light, I think we can actually put in a little bit more reflected light right down in here. So I'm glad I have my value scale all mixed up here because I can easily guess. Or I can make an educated guess, and that's going to be too light, so I'm going to go darker. I'm using the colors that are on my palette in a systematic way, so I can just go up and down the value scale. That still looks too light. There we go. It's better. Okay. Now that I put in that lightest reflected light, I'm going to now try and cover the rest of this with a slightly darker color, or the same color that's down there, a slightly darker color than this one. So that I'm covering the whole shadow shape. I'm covering the whole form shadow with new paint. Like so. And what that did was it kind of left a darker rim along the edge of the shadow shape, and that's a good thing because that actually exists. Could have a little more light sneaking in. Notice I'm avoiding the edges. I really don't want to bring too much light all the way to the edge, because I worked hard to darken it and make it turn back. Okay, that looks better. Now I'm going to jump to what I think is the color next to the shadow. So the darkest halftone. And this is very tricky to get right. And I'm going to show you a method that might seem a little unconventional at first, but it's not. It's actually what a lot of us do. So I put down a color here that's like, wow, why did she do that? It's so dark. But the reason is because if you jump too light, too fast at this area, this key area transitioning out of the shadow, it's going to flatten out. This is the most important value transition, out of the shadow and into the light. And it's easier to lighten something than it is to darken something sometimes. So I'm very carefully laying in that color. Now I'm going to soften the edge while still maintaining where I know the edge of my shadow shape is. Now I'm going to take the next value jump. My palette's getting a little messy. I'll test this value up here. This value is a little bit lighter. And I think I should go a little bit lighter than that. Yeah. What I'm doing is I'm taking the brush and I'm leaving part of the old color, that dark one that I was like, this is unconventional. And I'm sneaking this one as almost like a tile, as like a stripe. And I'm going to do the same thing again. I'm going to leave part of this new stripe and paint on a lighter color. So you can see the difference. You can see the stripe. Just barely different. Oops. Too much white on the edge of my brush there. That was an error. I'm going to take this color, even if it's a little too dark, and put it all around the outside, which will help me avoid a halo. Now, I'll take a new brush, about the same width if I have one. Do the same thing. Paint over. Make sure it is lighter though. Paint over half of what you already painted. That wasn't very much lighter, so I'm gonna go lighter. Now, we don't want to go and make this a gray sphere. We have to be very careful to start making it light enough. And it's not getting light enough because I keep trying to use the same brush. Let's try this. There we go. Not painting all the way up to the edge. Too much paint. Now I'm able to evaluate and say, okay, you know what? It got too dark up there. So let's gradually lighten a little bit. Gradually push the light out a little bit and move forward. Now it looks a little stripy. That's okay. I'm going to take a new brush. I'm going to go just off of pure white. And anywhere where that got a little contaminated, kind of try and neaten up like that. And then I'm going to try and put in fact, I can paint over this whole thing. And now try to put in where that highlight would be in pure white. This would be considered like a first layer of the painting. And at this point, now that I have a bunch of values down there, I would take a clean brush and try and soften some of these brush strokes that happened when the paint got a little bit too thick. So I'm going to start here. And now I can't take this same brush and move it over here or over here. It would be way too dark for over there and way too light for over there. So I'm just using it as a softening tool, really, for the paint that's already up here in that layer. And then I can take another brush and do the same thing. So at this point, that blending can really become your enemy. So we really just want to let this sit and dry so that we can make other subtle corrections later, because we've achieved a lot of form here. And if we start to do too much softening, it will eradicate that form. The one thing I do want to definitely do is knock down any ridges that are catching light with a clean brush. And I'm going to go through and just go around in circles to just try and soften just a little bit. The other thing is that the bedbug line is a little bit too dark and too thin, so I'm gonna take a clean brush and extend it out a little bit. And I'm also going to tap along the edge of this shadow to soften. And you never want to worry too much at this stage, because there's another layer and you can fix all those things in that layer. So the fact that it looks a little indented here, how it's not so smooth and perfect there, that's fine, we can let it be. But you really don't want any ridges. So then what I do is I take a nice soft haired brush and just go over, and if it messes up some of the values, so be it. But it's better to have a nice flat surface than it is to have ridges dry that you have to then scrape off later. So this soft brush is blending a little bit, but more so what I'm using it to do is to not have any topography to the paint. And you can do this all over the painting. Especially at the edges of things. All right, and that's where we're going to end off for now. Like I said, it's not perfect, but it's a great start, and there's good form there. So we can work with it and perfect it on our final layer.